This is Ricky Egge with Tufin. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering for the Americas. And today what we're going to cover is Segmentation Simplified. So this is talking about visualization and planning from ground to cloud, and actually understanding how we build our segmentation, and then some of the tools that Tufin can provide to help you along that segmentation journey. So, why are we doing what we do here at Tufin? And it's a couple of things that we want to cover, right? Reducing the risk to your crown jewels. We want to understand what's important to your business, what's required to make it run. We want to create more secure paths through the network. So we actually want to understand from here to here, how do we go through this path, and then what can talk, and looking for low and no code ways to work faster. So this is the opportunity to use things like APIs or other tools to enable teams to participate in security policy management and compliance without requiring too much of an uplift from a development perspective. And then at the end of the day, ensuring auditability so that you can actually come in and check and say, yes, these policies and the rules and things that we put into place, we're adhering to them and doing the things we're supposed to be doing. Why is this a challenge, and why is Tufin doing this? It's because hybrid security makes our jobs harder. It doesn't have to, but it a lot of times it does. So what we're doing is we're seeing enterprises are rapidly adopting cloud and IoT. So we've seen since 2020 a huge explosion in moving to public cloud, and this has resulted in some complex fragmented networks and large attack surfaces. And as a result, we're seeing more firewalls go in here, additional firewalls and security measures like security groups, things like this. And a lot of times there's not necessarily an effective, comprehensive, and automated policy management solution that goes along with it. The management of those things is still fragmented amongst different teams, and there's really no central place to understand how traffic flows through those areas. So as part of Segmentation Simplified, what we're going to get into is centralizing visibility in your rules and security groups and how you can do that with Tufin, and then visualizing your current state of segmentation and understanding what currently exists, refining segmentation with a centralized council, identifying changes that are required for segmentation, and then we're going to get into a sneak peek on R23.1 being released in May. So there's going to be some good functionality built into that we're really looking forward to. So when you're starting out with segmentation, you really want to start with a rough plan of how do I break it all apart? And this is where you really want to focus on classifying the assets and the important assets, right? If you're in a manufacturing area, the manufacturing network, separating that off and controlling who can talk to it. Grouping like assets together, right? If you have security systems at different locations, there's probably a central team that needs access to those. If you have, heating and cooling systems, HVAC, stuff like this, classify those assets together and then classify who gets access to them and understand who owns them and what do they need to do with those. And then at the end of the day, documentation. So being able to write down in a CMDB or even a spreadsheet if you have to, right? Who owns this asset, who's responsible for it, so that you can go back to that team in the future if needed. And then we look at how are assets alike. So if you look at similar systems at different locations, I use the example of security systems, but you can also look at things like Active Directory servers, right? Those are usually spread out amongst multiple locations, but they're the same system. You look at your users, even though we don't think of those as systems, your users are typically the same at different locations. And then we also look at things like applications. So how are assets alike? If you look at different tiers of the same application, like a web tier and an app tier and a database tier, being able to break those pieces apart to understand how they should be able to communicate and how that meshes together in the application. And then look at things like shared services, like your monitoring and management, your user base, etc. And then finally, how do I group these assets together? And this is where you get into things like security group tags, and in on-prem environments, you're looking at like subnets, segments, group membership. In the cloud area, you're looking at security group membership. You're looking at accounts and VPCs, and even still subnets. Subnets still work in the cloud environment, and it's actually a lot of times is easier because as you move there, you can create a new subnet for an application or subnets for an application and put them into those areas, and actually can create their own little kind of container for those based on that subnet. So that's one of the reasons I say it doesn't have to be as hard to segment in the cloud or to use security policies, because we have things like that allow us, as we're doing the migration, to make things easier. And this is kind of an example of, this is a building control system, where you have all kinds of different things that are happening. And this is an idea of how you could segment these different things or understand this application. Who needs access in? Is it, application servers and enterprise, stuff like this, but also then what's in it. So if you look in the blue on the south side of this picture, you're looking at all of the different parts that are part of the process controllers and PLCs and things like this that are kind of hidden, that should all be grouped together, be able to communicate, and then you control the access in and out of what needs to get into there from control consoles and engineering workstations, et cetera, from that perspective. So this is just kind of an example of one way you may build documentation and may classify the apps together into different pieces of the same application. So what does that look like in the Tufin area as we build and segment these applications out? So Tufin uses something called zones and policies in here. So in the Unified Security Policy at Tufin, or the USP as we'll call it, there's many zones. And those zones are actually the segments of your application. So think of this as the groups of IP addresses that you used to align applications and different parts of your network together. So this can be anything from a /8, all of the RFC 1918 space, all the way down to individual IP addresses. So it allows you to do things though, as like pull things in from an IPAM instead of housing it just in us. Like we really shouldn't be the database for this information. That should be part of the asset information at its core. So in an ITSM or a CMDB type scenario, and we're just a user or a consumer of that information to help build the policy. So how do you build these zones and policies, and how do you get to good in the segmentation scenario? So re-IP where possible, right? Assign groups, create new accounts for applications in the cloud. So you think in Azure and GCP and AWS, you have that ability to create multiple accounts that you can actually use to break your applications apart. And there's features and functionality that allow you to join the accounts together in a centralized manner so they can share information, use shared services. And then finally using like security groups. And the other thing you can look at too is when I'm segmenting, how do I do this? Is it migration to a cloud? In this case, there's a lot of lift and shift that's happening, creating a very hybrid infrastructure for most of our clients. And the problems generally stay the same there, where you have you're looking for the visibility, you're looking to ensure proper security controls, things like this. So that's where we talk about installing those security controls like firewalls and security groups. Is it new VMware infrastructure that you're moving to, right? That allows you to use other tools like maybe an NSX. And at the end of the day, using tools to build a security policy and go from any to specific rules. So using things like the automatic policy generator to actually be able to ingest traffic and understand what's using a rule in production. So Tufin uses a couple of things along this as well. So as part of the USP, we're looking at, allowing certain areas of the network. So what you think you have versus what you really have. So the policy might say, we're only going to allow HTTP and SSH between these two zones. But at the end of the day, when you look at production, you said you thought HTTPS should be in there, but comparing it to what you really have, in reality, production only had SSH. So you can actually remove that HTTPS standard. It shouldn't be added, especially if nothing is using it today, right? You should be making an exception going forward and making a conscious decision to add additional access when that time rises. And I say kind of cloud, on-prem, doesn't matter, right? So that's where we look at cloud security tools, and cloud security policy should be the same, right? So as on-prem, so you're able to understand those different assets, the CIS benchmarking of those tools, and being able to build a cloud security policy that mimics your on-prem policy so that you can understand, even if you're using totally cloud native controls, how they communicate and what they're using to communicate. And now we're going to get into demo time. So, centralizing your visibility into rules and groups, and we're going to get into that, and visualizing the current state, refining that segmentation policy a little bit, and then identifying changes that are required. And we'll do a little sneak peek on R23.1, which is being released in May, and we'll talk about a few of those features. And I am going to tell you right now, so if you do have questions and answers, submit them into the Q&A tab. I will leave the Q&A tab up here for a moment before I flip over to the demo, but absolutely submit those questions over via the Q&A. So As we get into the demo here, one of the things you're going to see in the dashboard on Tufin is the ability to be able to go through and understand exactly what's going on in your infrastructure. So I mentioned that centralizing visibility. This is actually a dashboard that's pulling in all of your firewalls, your routers, your switches, and your cloud accounts. So your AWS or your AWS accounts, your Azure subscriptions, your GCP projects, and being able to actually identify those things, group that all together, see how many firewall rules you need, and then it's actually taking that information, allowing you to build some cleanup trends around it, so you can understand, how many shadowed rules, disabled rules, or unused rules you have across that environment. It's also looking at things like compliance trends. So we're going to get into security policy a bit here, and rules that violate your corporate security policy. Right, so it allows you to help visualize kind of that current state of your segmentation and the current state of that cleanup, and then how you can actually start refining this policy. So the first thing that we're going to get into is actually visualizing that current state of your segmentation. We're going to start with the zones. So you saw this briefly in the spreadsheet here, in that screenshot in the presentation. But what you're going to see here with the zones is that you're actually going to have the ability to go through, and you can manually create zones, things like this. So you have the ability to create a zone name and do that. You have the ability to view all of your zones and the subnets that they're a part of. This is both IPv4 and IPv6 already. And then you also have the ability to build zone hierarchies and nest zones within each other. So when I talked about things like building tiers of like application, you might, I have Amsterdam EXT here as a zone, and underneath this I had site A, site B, and external. These could be tiers of an application, and Amsterdam external would be the overarching application as well. But I could also build policies and build zones for each one of those sub tiers in the application. So that's where you look at this and see this information out there, and this helps you to kind of start to get that visualization of those different segments. Now, ingesting all of this information I mentioned is kind of paramount. Tufin shouldn't be the source of the truth for what those zones are and what's in them, but what we should be as consumers of this. And that's actually where we look at how do we partner it out there and pull information in from other areas of the infrastructure. So this is where we're able to actually grab information from different IPAM solutions. You'll see 4 of them here. There's others on the roadmap. And you're actually able to pull those attributes and pull things like zone information based on the attribute name zone. And it's going to actually take that and auto-populate that based on the zone and info blocks. It'll pull that information into Tufin, and you'll be able to then consume that and use that in building the unified security policy. So once this information, the zones are populated, you can actually go ahead and build USPs, or unified security policies. I'll refer to them as USPs going forward. So in a USP, you're able to do several different things, and this is where you're actually going to be able to define your traffic. So between different areas of the network, you'll see I have AWS, I have backup sites in here. I have many different things in these zones. So I'm going to actually use sales to the data center as this example, and I'm going to drill into this. And you have several options in here. You can go and do things like, say, sales should not be able to talk at all to the data center. Sales should be able to allow everything to the data center, or much more consistently, you're going to actually have something that's customized. And then you have the option to build an allowable list of services or a blacklist of services. Now, because this is the policy and not the rules in production, this is what you view as acceptable, right? So this is your current view of what's acceptable in here. So if I look at the allowed list of services, I have these services. I'm also able to put additional guidelines around what these rules should look like. Can I have any in the sources, destinations, or services? Can I have explicit, can I have comments and logging, or are they required? And other additional things like how granular are the rule, and how long can a rule be unused before it becomes a violation of my corporate policy? The default unused rule reporting in Tufin is 365 days, 1 year. But we're seeing nowadays, especially in things like PCI, where you're doing a rule review every 180 days, that the last hit within day period can be much shorter. So maybe it's a public-facing DMZ, and if it doesn't get used in 30 days, you want to be notified. In PCI environments, you may set this to 180 days. And you can also set how many sources, destinations, services that you want to be able to have in an additional rule here. So you can get very granular on what you need. You can set the flow types from host to host, subnet to host, host to subnet. etc. And then the severity of this and add descriptions. You can also copy and paste cells. You can copy a cell, paste a cell configuration in here into a new cell, etc. So it becomes easier to use, and you're able to kind of visualize what that security policy looks like. Now, the challenge that most of our clients tell us is, this is great. How do I get started? And I will tell you, the first thing you're going to want to get started with is actually something a little simpler. And what you're going to want to get started with in the simplest areas is actually and this gets into kind of refining that segmentation policy, right? First things you want to do is find out, what's my risky services? So as part of this, you're actually going to go through and say, these are the things that I absolutely want to block. So I'm going to, you'll see anything from, admin to admin, and anything else to admin is going to be very limited in here. So these are the global services that I don't want to see anywhere in my infrastructure. So I'm going to create a group or a USP that has this documented with that criticality for things I don't want to see. The other thing that you're going to want to do is, as you look at this, you're going to want to build some rule properties, best practices, and these are the two that you typically start with. So in here, now I'm not focused on the services so much, but I'm focused on that rule attributes. Like, are there any in the sources, destinations, or services? Do I have comments and logging? So the first of the 3 USPs I showed you actually had all 3 of these different scenarios in it. But this is typically how you build it, as you break it apart. You have the risky services, you have the rule properties, and then the third USPs you get are the more business focused. Like, what is this application supposed to look like? What is it allowing? You're not just looking at the block list portion of that. And then once you get into that, what should that application be allowing? That's where it becomes a lot more, well, we don't really know. So we want to look and see what we have. So this is where Tufin actually gets into the security policy builder application. So what this does is it takes and it compares your USP, or unified security policy, back to your production environment, so you can actually see the differences. So one of the things you'll see in here is the conflicts. So if we wanted to look at this, I think I looked at sales. So we're going to look at P_sales. And we looked, I think, to the data center. So we'll scroll through and see this data center here, P to sales to data center. And when we looked at the rules, we saw that the current cell had several things in it. It had TCP 3306, UDP 53, etc. When we looked at, so this current cell column I'm looking at here, when we looked at rule analysis, what's actually out in production, we saw that there was only SSH and HTTPS. And we saw we had flow to subnet in the current cell. In reality, all of the rules were host to host. It has a comment. We can actually go, hey, we want to flip this to has comment enabled. Logging should be enabled, etc. And then you're going to look at how long have we gone without hits. So the last hit within 30 days, the last hit's disabled. So you can go through and build this based on what you actually have out in production. So this goes and allows you to build that security policy and to build all of those USPs in a much more efficient manner. Now, once you have all of these policies built, what you're able to do is actually get back in to the initial application, and that's where it builds all of this information back into the dashboard. So I mentioned before, you're going to have those different USPs. Now, when you come in and look at these violations, you're able to actually see, hey, I want to drill in, I want to see all my medium violations. And I can actually take a look. I'm going to be able to drill in and see, here's a rule with a medium violation. I can see my sources, destinations, services, etc. I can also get into the violations status. In this case, the service is TLS 1.0. And in this case, the security requirement was only allow SMTP and TFTP. So I can actually hover over and see, what sources are in R&D, which sources are in DC4. So I have that visibility. But the beauty of this is, am I able to refine my segmentation policy? I am. I'm able to do a couple of things with this. I'm able to actually go through, I can send this rule back to the business owner and say, hey, is this still necessary, Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner? Are we still looking to keep this rule in production? I can decommission the rule altogether. So in some cases, maybe everything in here is just bad or it's not being used, and you're able to actually go through and help do this. Or when we talk about refining that segmentation policy, here's where you can actually go through and modify that rule as well. So in this case, I can go through and I can open a ticket, put it in my rule modification workflow. Maybe I need to remove a source, a destination, a service, something like that, so that I can actually go through and do those things. So when we look at that segmentation policy and refining it, it really gets into several things. The first is classifying it. It's identifying what those assets are, who owns them, identifying what needs to talk to what, who needs to talk to who, and then being able to, in the refinement piece of this, we look at how do I identify the rules that are outside the scope of this and identify those changes. So that's where we start to look at the violations and things like this. Now, we've talked about and showed you the on-prem version, and I did mention we do have a cloud version of this. So as we jump over to the cloud side, the problem stays the same, right? How do I identify those assets? What do those assets look like? So you'll see I have the cloud security violations with low, medium, high, right, in here as well. I have other things like internet access, risky ports, all of these things. The dashboard looks a little different, but we're looking at it from a cloud native perspective. One of the differences that you'll see in assets between on-prem and cloud is how they're classified. So I'm going to just use this analytics VM here. There's several different things that you use in the cloud environments to break those assets apart. And one of those things that's really incredible is tags. So this is where I say it doesn't have to be as hard to do security in the cloud or in a hybrid infrastructure as sometimes we make it out to be. And that's especially true if we could start to use tags and use that information to build security policies around what should be able to talk. So in this case, I have several tags, account, Azure demo, the applications, Jira. I have a connection to firewall. I have an environment. I have all kinds of different tags that can be built, and we can build tags on other pieces as well. So I have a client that doesn't use tags at all, but they use a very good naming convention, and we're able to build tags from that naming convention, build meta tags just in Tufin from that naming convention that they're able to use for their security policy. And when I mention the security policies, I think of these as the CSP is the equal to the USP in the on-prem version. So when I look at this, what we can do is go to we'll look at this demo policy here. And instead, we're able to use things like tags to define things. So in here, I'm saying that for every account that I have, if anything is app tier and it's going to the DB tier, the storage should be read-only. And I'm looking and saying anything that comes from the finance application to the billing application should be HTTPS. And anything from the CRM to these different web server 1, 2, and 3 should be HTTPS. And I can go ahead and add rules in here. Policy name, we'll just call it Ricky's demo. And you can put a description, inherit the severities, things like this. For the rule scope, I can do within each, and let's go subnet. The actions, maybe I'm broken out by subnets within my applications. So anything internal to that application should be in allow all. And I could do this and so within each subnet, allow those different things. And you could also do within the rule scopes, you could do explicit. So you can go from, different properties, maybe from internet to property, and we'll go with tags in here, and the tag will be tier web in here, and instead of allow all, we're going to do customized, and we'll build an allow list, and we'll say from any to the tags again, and the tag is going to be tier web, and the service is going to be HTTPS. And we're going to say anything from the web to HTTPS. We'll go ahead and add that tag in there so that you'll actually have that visibility. So you can go through and build your rules, build everything out in the same way that you do in your on-prem infrastructure. So this helps you to go through and to go back to that dashboard and identify those changes that you want to be making, you want to understand out there in production. So you'll be able to go see then how many rules, which objects have violations, etc. The last thing that I'm going to hit on from a segmentation perspective is what we refer to as the automatic policy generator. So what the automatic policy generator does is it allows you to go through and select from your devices, and I'm going to use a Palo Alto. I'll use my San Fran cluster here as an example, and it's going to show me all of my rules, show me how permissive they are in here, and it gives me the opportunity to go ahead and clean them up. So in this case, I have subnet, source subnet a /24 to another /24, and this is wide open, it's all services. Well, I don't think that seems right. I want to actually see what's communicating in this tier and create a policy from it to replace this very permissive rule. So once I go through and I get that portion of it completed, I've selected the rule, created a job for it for a period of time, I'm actually able to kind of go through and see what's going on. So I'll use the ASA rule here as an example. When I started, this was a /24 to a /32. So it's a smaller scope. But what you're able to do is then watch the traffic over time and see, in this case, I had .40 through .49 out of that /24 going to that /32. And here were my ports and protocols. Now I could create a much tighter rule based on this, just doing an IP range even to that end with just the IPs of that those 10 addresses to that .0. Or I can also even add in the ports and protocols, or I can get as granular as I want and actually add all these rules. So where you see this being really beneficial is when you're taking what used to be maybe a layer 3 switch or a flattened network, and you're trying to put firewalls in, and you can't do it because you don't understand what's actually out there. So instead of putting the firewall in with an actual rule base on it, you put it in and it says from any source to any destination, any service permit. And it's very open, but you're logging all of that data. The old way to do it would be to use Splunk to do these things in here. And at the end of the day, it just isn't tenable for somebody to be able to go through and pull that information. So this is where you're going to be able to use the automatic policy generator to be able to document and understand what's using that rule. So an example client from a real life example, have a customer of mine that put this in their manufacturing network, ran the APG for a week, and what they saw was 170,000 different sources, destinations, and service were using that rule into that manufacturing network through that new firewall they had just installed. So it was really hard to review. So one of the things that you're going to see is if we go through and look at rules in here, we have something called a balance graph. So in their case, I only can create 20 rules from this example. In their case, it was like 170,000. That didn't make sense. So what we selected, there was a number on the graph that was like 72 rules. And that seemed like a pretty good summary to start for where a firewall had never existed before. So we went through, selected that, and then we were able to actually grab an export of this. It kicks out a CSV for you. In here, so you're actually able to go through and see the initial rule, all of the things that it's going to export, and then we took that CSV and sorted through it a bit more, grouped together like things that we knew were similar, like monitoring and things. And at the end of the day, they were able to take that 70 rules and replace that any to any rule in their firewall, rerun the job on that any rule another week or two. And they were able to come back and say, okay, now we actually have a rule base. This is what should be able to talk to that infrastructure. And they actually put a firewall in place where none had previously existed. So that really helped to lock down that infrastructure. And at any time, they can go back and analyze those other rules they had put in to determine should they be appropriate, should they not be appropriate, right? But that required further work with that, with the process owners and the engineers that were running that manufacturing floor to understand what did they really need in there as well. But it was a great start, and it really helped speed that process because they would have never been able to do it running queries for Splunk or something like that. Going to do one more thing. We're going to get into the roadmap for our R23-1. So we'll be looking at that here shortly. So we're going to look and say 2022 was a pretty busy year here for Tufin. Some of the things that we released were full automation for checkpoint inline layers, panorama application ID over non-default ports, IPv6 topology. We've added Azure Firewall Visibility, Azure Load Balancer, Fortinet SD-WAN. So those are just some of the things that we've added. We had a added support for over 100 million routes in topology. The actual number is closer to 300 million, but marketing doesn't like us to say that out loud, or engineering, I should say, just because but it is a very large number, and it does function very quickly at that scale. And then some of the things that we're looking for product focus beyond is automation. And these are Tufin's focuses, right? So we have that vision of why are we doing what we're doing, securing the crown jewels. How do you do it? You focus on automation, you focus on the cloud and the hybrid infrastructure, and then you focus on how do we do it at scale and how do we do it efficiently. So when we look at R23.1, which is actually going to be going GA here in May, the release candidate is available if you want to test it out. We're adding provisioning for Cisco Nexus. We're adding the ability to commit only changes made by Tufin in Panorama. So instead of committing everything, we're going to commit just what we've done. We're adding automation for Checkpoint FQDN. So Checkpoint deployed the API so that you can manage it through CMA now, through Smart Center. Which is awesome because now it allows us to manage FQDN like we do for Palo Alto and Fortinet through there. We're able to pull in AWS Gateway Load Balancer and topology, so you can fully visualize the topology path from your on-prem infrastructure into AWS. And we already had this for Azure already. So this is completing that topology there. And then a big one for us is Cisco Meraki firewall support. So this is everything from topology, rules, violations, etc., being able to see all of those, and a bunch of enhancement tags, enhancements in Azure and AWS as well, from verifier support and tag support, ASG support, and then TOS over Red Hat 8 and Tufin OS 4 is actually coming out. It's kind of been a quiet launch. It'll be an official launch here later in the summer. And when we look at some of the sneak peeks, one of the things is a new dashboard for the tasks list in 23.1. So this gives you a much better view of where you're sitting from an SLA perspective, where your rules are assigned, what all tickets are out there, how long they've been there, what steps they're at. So it's a much better visibility view into what's actually waiting and what's been done in there. And this is my favorite part because this is something that came out of the Tufin's hackathon. We call it Tufinathon in 2022. So it was the ability to actually build groups of devices within the map. This has been something my customers have been asking for a long time. So I'm pretty happy to have this one out there. So before you could never group objects together. If you did, they didn't stay. This allows you to build that custom view, set it out there, and then have it deployed. So you can group by domain, by device, build custom views based on what's important to you to be able to understand those in the topology out there as well. So this is something that we were super excited to have and to release. So there's just a couple of the new features that we were looking for out there in R23.1, which is again available in May. And so again, we'll turn this back over to questions and answers. And so we want to hear from you. Get those in, and I will try to answer them here on the webinar. And if not, we can send a follow-up out and try to answer any of the questions that do come in. Thank you very much.